Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Global Insights in Professional Security. There are many fine podcasts out there on security and risk. What makes this program different is that we look at big themes in security vis-a-vis societal trends, industries, and phenomena such as digital transformation, law, criminal justice, and disinformation. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Don Erickson to the program. Don is the CEO of the Security Industry Association, the premier trade association for security providers. Rather than advance through the association executive pipeline or join his association from the ranks of security members, Don took the legislative affairs and government relations pathway, having directed those functions for a senator, an organization of rural telecom companies, Alcatel-Lucent, and finally at SIA itself. That fits nicely into our theme today, in which we continue a topic on security and government, but it gets a new angle today. First, welcome and thank you, Don.
Mike, it's always great to be with you. And there aren't many New York Jet fans in the security industry, Mike. So anytime I can get together with a fellow Jet fan is a good opportunity.
Yeah, and it's it's a difficult time. However, there's hope on the horizon with the new draft pick, but there always is hope, isn't there?
There's always a hope. Hope springs eternal. I've heard this 3 or 4 times before with quarterbacks, so we have our fingers crossed.
Exactly. So, great to have you on the show. I want to get right into it.
Great.
Talk about more favorable prospects than the Jets this season. Tell me about the recently passed U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. How does it affect your members as well as the larger security marketplace?
So, Mike, for your listeners, just as a reminder, SIA has traditionally represented manufacturers. That's been our core base. So, therefore, any incentive to R&D funding is going to become a priority for our organization in terms of advocacy. The legislation you referenced was passed by the Senate with very strong bipartisan support. It is basically a reform bill of the National Science Foundation, which offers and manages a number of R&D programs specifically for our members. This legislation authorizes a considerable amount of money for biometric and identity management R&D, which in my view is a good that level of investment is a good complement to the investment we see occurring organically in the marketplace. So we're very supportive of the legislation. And also in terms of geopolitics, it's a piece of legislation that positions the U.S. very strongly in a leadership position as it relates to R&D as well as technology innovation.
Gotcha. And you had mentioned it complements the organic R&D. I wanted to ask, there's so much money going into things like AI, robotics, machine learning that this legislation addresses. Why is government funding and why is a government initiative required when the free market seems to be pushing in that direction anyway? Is it
I
just
don't
the national priority aspect of it?
no, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, first of all. And I think as an industry organization, we have
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
as are we okay?
Good.
As an industry organization, we have a responsibility to ensure that our companies, those that we represent, are as competitive as possible on a global stage. So as I mentioned earlier, I do believe those incentives are appropriate because they support the investment already being made by the companies. And I think for the United States to attract investment to our industry and throughout the country, the U.S. has to invest in those type of programs.
Gotcha. Excellent. Thank you. So I'm a little bit reluctant to talk about COVID because that's been the drumbeat, the unalterable drumbeat for the last year and 3 months. But coming out of COVID now, what are SIA's federal legislative priorities?
Sure. Well, let me say this first, Mike. As you know very well, I spend a lot of time talking to member companies as well as non-member companies. And what I'm happy to say, and you may share this view, there's a tremendous amount of optimism in the industry right now. There are also some threats, which your question alludes to. And for us, as a federal advocacy organization, the number one threat our industry faces are proposed limits on the federal side as well as the state and local side as it relates to facial recognition technology, which perhaps we'll talk a little bit about. But it's been very distressing to see the number of proposals that have been introduced on a state and local basis, as well as yesterday, Senator Markey in Massachusetts introduced once again a very comprehensive proposal that's a blanket ban on the use of FR, which is not good for government agencies, certainly not good for the private sector, and not good, most importantly, for citizens, right? And which goes a little bit to the ordinance that was passed by Baltimore. So for us, facial recognition is a top priority. However, even though we represent suppliers, we do a lot of work in advocacy to help the security needs of security practitioners, whether that be on the regulatory compliance side, helping practitioners understand government regulations, whether it be data privacy or cybersecurity or other vertical market related compliance requirements coming out of FERC or NERC or other agencies, DOJ. We try to help practitioners understand what those mean. So broadly speaking, we follow a lot of regulatory activity across many different agencies, principally coming out of FEMA and I'd say the Department of Justice and Department of Commerce. Then we have many companies who are on the GSA Multiple Award Schedules program, or government contractors. And as you may know, those contracting policies, while might not seem that most very exciting on a day-to-day basis, they're always changing the terms and conditions. So we stay on top of that quite a bit and to ensure that the policies are fair and not burdensome and consistent for our members. And then I would say, lastly, Mike, appropriations. I don't think there's an industry organization that works harder, in my opinion, I'm biased, to ensure that grant programs that can be used by practitioners for security projects are fully funded. Examples of that would be the Port Security Grant Program, Transit Security Program, as well as the federal Secure Our Schools program. And Mike, as an aside, one of the things that I'm particularly proud of at SIA, just over my right shoulder, is a lanyard that's framed by a student who was sadly part of the attack on the high school down in Parkland High School. And that student sent me his badge, his lanyard, with a short note just telling me how much they appreciated and his family appreciated the work done by SIA to support school security funding initiatives. So school security is very much a part of our advocacy program as well.
Well, that's very edifying to see that the efforts you're making on a grand scale, sort of away from everything, are really having an impact. You know, with that school child at Parkland, and in people's everyday lives, that must be really, it was really touching.
It's very touching. It's very gratifying. You and I are both parents, right? So to see that the work of an association can have that kind of an impact through advocacy is very, very important.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. So you mentioned the. I'm glad you mentioned the facial recognition and specifically Baltimore, because there's so much activity going on. You deal with a lot of federal regulation, appropriations, as you said, legislation. But for all that was going on federally, there's so much other conflicting, so many conflicting initiatives happening in cities, states, and counties. And you mentioned Baltimore cracking down severely on facial recognition, and I'm of the mind that, and maybe because I'm an optimist, but the same similar things happened with CCTV or video surveillance, where everybody thought, okay, this is the end of privacy as we know it, and now yawn video surveillance and analytics, and this may be a little bit of a tougher battle, but without, I don't want to get too far afield on that. Tell me about the Baltimore example. You referred to it earlier, and this is a good time to get back to it.
So Baltimore has, by a vote of 13-2, recently passed an ordinance in the city that would ban the use of facial recognition technology completely throughout the city. So by government agencies and, in an unprecedented way, Mike, by private businesses for the services that they provide to citizens, and essentially criminalizing the use of facial recognition technology in Baltimore for citizen services, which is very distressing. The ban lasts through the end of 22, But I'll share a little bit of news here on the podcast. We are actively looking at a possible legal challenge to the ban, so as not only to delay its enforcement, but also to prevent other localities from developing and enacting similar ordinances. Because I think what you're alluding to, Mike, is that the patchwork of laws, whether you're talking about facial recognition technology or data privacy or anything dealing with regulatory structures, when businesses have to spend time complying with different sets of laws and rules and requirements, it's very, very costly. And those are resources taken away from providing quality services, right? In the case of security services. So we actively testified against the Baltimore ordinance. I will tell you that the privacy advocates were extremely organized and well intentioned. However, these proposals are not very balanced, right? They're serving one constituency. In the case of Baltimore, really didn't take into the view sufficiently enough the perspective of private businesses and the services they provide. For example, the banking community, the use of FR to prevent fraud, the effectiveness of facial recognition to combat human trafficking in hotels throughout Baltimore and elsewhere. So I don't think those positive aspects of FR were really contemplated by the city council in Baltimore, which is extremely unfortunate. But Mike, we're seeing that across the country. From Portland to Baltimore, coast to coast, there's this rush to pass these type of laws without really thoughtful, deliberative, I would say, consensus building approaches to policymaking. So we are looking at it. We'll see what options we can take. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, combating FR legislation is going to remain a top priority for us. And it reminds me, Mike, of I think about 15 years ago, you may remember the battle over RFID technology in California. Same thing. I mean, over privacy concerns, except they were proven wrong, I think, for the most part. And at that time, Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed that legislation, and we were very active on it. But I think for our industry, it's something that directly impacts customers and their ability to have really proven technologies. I mean, just look at the work that NIST is doing, Mike, right, with their testing program that we're very supportive of. And the legislation that we talked about earlier on competitiveness also provides funding to support the NIST testing program. I think those type of investments are a much better approach than trying to impose these type of restrictions that the city of Baltimore recently passed.
Yeah, those are great points. I noticed, as you know, and we were colleagues and friends when I was my 20 years plus at ASIS. There are relatively few issues that the security industry agrees on. Um, it's hard to lobby. It's hard to represent the interests of everybody because it may differ by industry. It may differ by role. It may differ by geography. One of the big issues that ASS faced was or dealt with was um, you know citizens leaving weapons in their cars on corporate premises, and that stirred a whole debate and whether companies could ban employees from bringing weapons. And we had a lot of members of the security industry who thought, certainly, um, according to OSHA, the requirements to have a safe workplace, duty of care, a company can say no, we don't want weapons on the site. But then there were very some strongly opposed were sort of Second Amendment, not absolutists, but fervent Second Amendment believers who said no, that overcomes the right of or surpasses the right of an organization to prohibit weapons on its site. So it kind of reminds me of it's very hard to get a handle and get something that everybody agrees with. In the case of Baltimore and some of these other cities, it seemed like a sort of expedient, like quick, easy win for their constituencies. Like, oh, all facial recognition is bad. That's easy. Let's cross that one off and go on to the next thing.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's politically expedient. Look at the city of Portland in Oregon. Look what's occurred, level of violence and chaos that's occurred in the city of Portland. We testified against the private sector ban in public spaces in Portland, directly to the mayor of Portland. And as the violence ensued and the chaos ensued throughout the city, what happened? The city of Portland came out and said, well, we've got to try other approaches to get this under control. Well, should have thought about facial recognition technology to identify those that were committing those acts of crime, right? And to get control of the city. So a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking, but that goes to my point about being more thoughtful with policy making. And to your point about consensus, Mike, I think definitely a challenge within ASIS when you were there, I'm sure, on policy. Not so much a challenge with us. There are certain strategies that we communicate to our members that they embrace. Number one is following investment, right? What's going to help our members' customers invest smartly in security infrastructure? So that gets to our whole grants philosophy. Secondly, is reducing regulation generally. Now, regulation can be a catalyst for investment too, but I think most of us in the industry could agree, I hope, that imposing regulation on technology that's constantly evolving and changing and improving and incorporating that into a statute where it's essentially frozen in the statute is not a good approach to policymaking. So we've been fortunate to have consensus around our positions for the most part.
No, that's a good approach, and that makes sense, especially in a field where, as you say, things are rapidly changing, and it takes legislation forever to get through. If it actually does, and then try to amend it, and and there's everybody packs in their own, you know, provisions. So if you try to amend one thing, everyone's worried about everything else that's in there. So I think that's a good approach. That's a wise approach you have in there. Try to keep it from being set in stone.
Right.
I want to move on to some other exciting things that SIA is doing. Something that's close to my heart is that you just added a new combination physical cyber certification. And we're at a time when convergence and integration are really taking hold. And we see cases of hackers taking control of poorly configured cameras and other devices and turning them against us. The certification seems like to hit a really a great need and important time. How did it come about, and what's been the reaction?
So, Mike, you may recall you and I were on a panel with Merlin Gilbo from ESA and Bill
Yes.
Bozeman, formerly of PSA, right? Down in Florida a couple of years ago. And I think the concept was talked about generally by some members of the audience at that time
Yes, I remember.
on that panel. So this came about through our partnership with PSA Security, which, as you know, we've had a long-standing relationship with PSA. It's been very helpful for both sides for a number of years, as well as securityspecifiers.com, Ray Kalum's organization, the consultants who are specifying security products in projects. We have collaborated for a number of years on different initiatives, and I think we all, including cybersecurity, came to a realization that installers of security systems need to demonstrate a certain level of expertise, knowledge, skills, and abilities around physical and cyber convergence when performing or servicing installations, both commercially and residentially. So it really came from that recognition. It's the Security Industry Cybersecurity Certification, or SICC, which officially launched on June 1. We're just going through the process now of beta testing the program with approximately 50 individuals. The response at PSA Tech and since has been phenomenal, including on social media. So very much appreciate your support. We feel very strongly that this addresses a clear need, which with your setup that you just described describes. And the going forward, I think we'll have a great response and participation in the program and have a stronger workforce as a result for integration companies.
Well, I salute you for doing it, having developed the certification when I was at ASIS, the APP. It is not easy to create a certification. You need buy-in, you need the expertise, um, you need to invest some money into it. There's a whole long process, as I'm sure you know, and I congratulate you for you're out of the starting gate, and everything I've heard sounds very positive. So
I appreciate
congratulations.
it. So, Mike, you're saying we have to invest money in this program?
Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
Um,
But Mike, let me just add to this. So as you agree, and you've been an evangelist of strengthening cyber hygiene within businesses and by practitioners for a long time, as you have been on data privacy as well. we always have to be remain vigilant, right? Yes, we hear about in the news isolated cases, Verkada or whomever, where that was more about just poor decision making, I think, in that particular case. But staying vigilant about cyber hygiene and encouraging companies to always look at their processes and always look for improvements in their cyber practices, I think is the cornerstone of what this is about. So, strategically for a business, investing in a workforce that has trained and certified installers, technicians, I think is a wise business decision.
Yeah, it sends the message from the top, and it reinforces the ethos that you really do have to practice constant hygiene, and it's so difficult to do. Even practitioners sort of you get a little lazy, but
Right.
I think that's a great step in the right direction. So I commend you. I can't resist speaking about ASIS one more time, having spent more than 2 decades there. But tell us some of the things. I know you and Peter O'Neill have worked on some things, and you have some new initiatives, new and old initiatives. What's going on with SIA and ASS, and maybe any other organizations that?
Yeah, no, happy to. First and foremost, you're missed. You did an
Uh,
amazing job at ASIS. So we miss having you part of these conversations.
thank you. I miss
Now,
it too.
now the culture has changed between ASIS and SIA. It would be great. It would be fun to have you back involved. Let me tell you. So Peter has been terrific to work with at ASIS. So going back a couple years, there are two projects that came to mind, and I'll talk about a third more recently. Number one, we invested together in research that looked at intelligent buildings and how an integrator, for example, can assess for its customer the vulnerabilities that exist in intelligent buildings related to cyber and physical security risk. And that was a research report produced through the ASIS Foundation that received a very good response. Secondly, we worked on a career pathways document or vision together that for both on the practitioner side, it defined a clear pathway where individuals can advance career-wise, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and likewise did on the supplier side, and we presented that at various events and before various audiences together. So I think that was very important, given that the number one challenge facing practitioners, Mike, as you know, as well as suppliers, is finding qualified talent. It's not a lack of resumes coming in the door, it's finding the right people. So I think providing some direction to college students and individuals from law enforcement and otherwise who are in career transition through the career pathways document was an extremely valuable contribution to the industry. Lastly, Peter and I didn't hesitate. We have a shared vision around DE&I and personal commitment to those principles. So last winter in December, we developed a lot of content around DE&I and had in fact, a global conversation for our mutual members about DE&I and what more practitioners and suppliers can do together to diversify their workforces and have the right practices in place. So those are three key projects that we worked on together. I will tell you that I have a tremendous amount of respect for ASIS. I think there's a lot more we can do together. Particularly, we can complement their education and training initiatives with our advocacy initiatives, because I think there's a lot of education that can go, earlier to your question, that can go to practitioners and their members about government requirements and regulation in general. So it's been a great experience working with them.
To reinforce your comments on diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, whatever you want to call it. Um, I know I've seen, we've actually both been in the past. I know your support for different women in security groups. There are various, and for the IOBSE, where we've both, presented and appeared. So it's so important, and it's sort of it's a topic that for so long the numbers have sort of stayed the same. It's like kind of ASIS membership 90% male, 10% female, and it was harder for you know um, non-whites to get into the industry. But I'm seeing a lot of good things now in the different women in security organizations, in different young professionals, and in other different outreach. We really need to broaden and bring more talent into the industry, and it's starting to work, I think. I mean, is that your impression as well, or?
Yeah, let me say a couple. No, very good point. Let me say a couple of things up front. Number one, the issue of DE&I is bigger than any one organization. with all due respect to SIA or any other association, it doesn't belong to an association. It belongs to society and the community. And this is why associations should exist, is to help address problems such as D&I as it relates to the workforce, number one. Number two, SIA, Mike, has spent a considerable amount of time trying to improve its outreach to colleges and universities, in particularly in diverse communities such as Trenton, New Jersey, where we developed a pilot program for community colleges about physical and IT security purposely in Trenton because of the diverse demographics of the student body. We also have worked really hard. You and I have talked a lot about advocacy here today. We've worked really hard to support efforts to increase funding for HBCUs, particularly engineering programs, because of our manufacturing base. And then what I'm proud of, and I'll be honest with you, and my team loves this when I stay out of the way, so I'm not going to claim any credit for this at all. It was really our team. Was we established what's called the Time Mentoring Program, which is Talent, Inclusion, Mentoring, and Education, is what that acronym stands for. It's been wildly successful. It's meant to reach a diverse audience within the industry as well as students around mentoring, and it's off to a great start. So I think those type of initiatives, I think are important. You mentioned the Women in Security Forum. ASIS has a terrific Women's Security Council. We're proud of the work that our forum is doing. It's growing every day. We have over 700 members of it today, as well as our RISE young professional community. So I think, Mike, continue to invest in those communities is extremely important piece of addressing DE&I. And I think they're more than communities or more than committees when you think about Women in Security Forum or RISE. They're really movements, right? I mean, they're really catalysts for change in the industry and in society. And I think there's a lot more we can do. Collaboration with ASIS around those communities or those movements, with PSA, with other organizations, with ESA, I think is really important. Because as I said at the very start, one organization can't do all of this.
Now, just to tie a bow on this issue, and I know I probably shouldn't call out one person for for sort of attention or accolades, but when you mentioned historically black colleges and universities, um, I think of Ron Martin, who we both know is a friend of both of ours, who personally funds students from those universities, and not necessarily African American, of all different races, and not just HBCUs, other colleges. And he pays for them to attend security conferences, become members of organizations like ASIS and IOBSE. And this guy really puts his money where his mouth is. I mean, he's, not to mention one person, but he really sticks out to me as like he lives what he preaches.
There's no one more genuine about this topic than Ron Martin, to your point. And he does back up his words with his actions. And he's been very generous with his time advising us on how we should approach student outreach. There are others, and it's growing, right? But Ron's top of the list. I mean, Eddie Reynolds with Illuminar
Yep.
comes to mind. Very passionate, very involved within SIA. But we're seeing a lot of new faces involved in the movement, which is very encouraging as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, any other initiatives or news you have for us, or anything you want to bring up?
Mike, when I was thinking about our conversation today and the relationship that you and I have had, I remember a few years ago that we ran a race together at ASAE in Toronto, and I realized I was behind you for most of that race. And I think I got ahead of you for a brief time. And I'll admit this in front of your audience, you won by about 15 seconds. I'll say 15 seconds. Maybe it was 20 or 30 seconds.
I think it was like 2, but
I don't know.
I'll take that.
I'll be inclined about it. But Mike, given your incredible career with ASIS in the industry and who you're representing today, you obviously have a deep relationship with the law enforcement community, in particular in public safety, and they have a lot of affection and respect for you. So it seems to me like you would be the ideal partner to work with me on something I thought about last night, which is the idea of, because you and I are runners, and I'm set up to do a couple of races this fall. Why don't you and I lead an initiative in the industry to enlist other runners throughout the industry to sign up for a great cause, which is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and pay our respects for all the first responders for their efforts over the years to help our country and our society recover from 9/11, and perhaps we can raise some money for tunnels to Tunnels to Towers, which is a great charity that's widely recognized. So if you're in, I'm in, and we can figure out the details later. But there's no better podcast to break some news, and this one is going to be the Gips Erickson run in support of Tunnels to Tower. So are you in?
Absolutely. You actually hit me in three different ways. So it's giving back. You got me there. It's obviously security and law enforcement and memory of, of 9/11. You got me there. And then a very personal level, the competition, the challenge. I mean, of course, but it's, more than a challenge. It's a communal event. So yes, I thank you for asking me, and definitely it sounds fantastic, and I'd be happy to work with you. And for listeners of this podcast, we will let you know more as we progress. So great idea, and thank you for asking me.
No, I'm glad to hear it. And so we've got some work to do together following this podcast, but we'll get it done. And I know between the two of us, we'll have a great response.
Excellent. So Don, that brings us to the end of our time today. Really great conversation. I've learned a lot more about what SIA does and some of the initiatives. And I've known you for a long time, and some of that definitely was news to me. So thank you so much.
Well, Mike, if we could surprise you with things, that's an accomplishment. So I appreciate that. But thanks for the opportunity.
My pleasure.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Sure. Thank you.